Prince Louis is currently 7 years old, and he is carrying the profound, invisible emotional weight of a grueling, traumatic year that very nearly shattered the foundation of the House of Windsor. The absolute most significant development in this entire narrative is that the notoriously guarded palace machinery has finally, remarkably, stopped pretending that absolutely everything behind closed doors was perfectly fine. This revelation did not arrive in the form of a cold, clinical, formal diagnosis, nor was it distributed via a highly sanitized press release overflowing with sterile medical jargon. Instead, the reality of the situation emerged through a quiet, deeply vulnerable confirmation embedded directly within Prince William's own candid words, explicitly acknowledging that the youngest Wales child struggled with his mental and emotional health in profound ways that absolutely nobody in the institution saw coming. When you actively strip away the glossy public relations veneer and carefully examine exactly what was officially said versus what actually transpired in the private shadows, the timeline reveals something significantly heavier and infinitely more complex than a privileged kid simply experiencing a bad few months. This was the heartbreaking reality of a highly scrutinized young child actively processing raw, existential grief in real time, all while the unforgiving eyes of the entire world simultaneously expected him to cheerfully wave from a glittering Buckingham Palace balcony. The most striking element of this entire ordeal is exactly how terrifyingly quiet the onset of the crisis truly was. There were absolutely no blaring sirens echoing across the royal estates, no dramatic, chaotic photographs of ambulances rushing to the hospital, and no frantic, manufactured tabloid frenzies featuring anonymous sources loudly fearing the absolute worst. The suffocating anxiety crept into their lives in the exact, insidious way that real, devastating family crises always do. It manifested silently through the incredibly small, unsettling disruptions in daily domestic life. It was a confused 6-year-old boy, acutely noticing that his normally omnipresent mother was inexplicably absent from the breakfast table. It was a beloved grandfather who was suddenly, terrifyingly too unwell to engage in the energetic, playful activities he used to enjoy so much. It was a home that fundamentally, atmospherically felt entirely different, vibrating with an unspoken tension, even when absolutely everyone inside its walls was desperately, exhaustingly trying to act completely normal. This heavily burdened atmosphere was precisely where young Prince Louis found himself in March 2024, the exact moment when Catherine bravely announced her shocking cancer diagnosis to the globe, following agonizing weeks of the parents desperately trying to figure out exactly how to gently break the devastating news to George, Charlotte, and Louis, in a way their young, fragile minds could possibly comprehend. Naturally, the ancient palace machinery reflexively did exactly what palaces are fundamentally designed to do. They ruthlessly managed the external message, tightly controlled the public narrative, and kept the vulnerable children entirely out of sight from the ravenous press. But you absolutely cannot legislate or control how a young child internally processes visceral fear, and you certainly cannot effortlessly spin a 7-year-old's deep-seated, paralyzing anxiety into a neat, easily digestible public relations line. Sources intimately close to Adelaide Cottage, the relatively modest, 4-bedroom historic house the Wales family deliberately, specifically chose, in order to intentionally keep their children grounded and away from the echoing, 40-staff environment of a massive palace, started quietly describing behavioral shifts that should rightfully make any empathetic parent's stomach drop. Louis, the vibrant, deeply expressive child, who became an absolute international sensation for adorably covering his ears and screaming during Trooping the Color, making hilarious, uninhibited funny faces at his mother, jumping exuberantly on carriage seats, and generally being utterly, beautifully unbothered by performing on a massive global stage, suddenly went terrifyingly quiet. The exuberant, joyful boy, who previously expressed absolutely every single emotion openly, who had never once learned to artificially hide his feelings because his secure environment meant he had never previously needed to, suddenly found himself overwhelmed by incredibly dark feelings entirely too big for his small body, and he utterly lacked the necessary emotional vocabulary to articulate them. He was only 6 years old when his mother had to sit him down and gently explain the horrific reality that she had cancer. 6. Try, for a moment, to imagine the sheer impossibility of explaining the brutal, systematic reality of chemotherapy treatments to a 6-year-old boy. Try explaining to him exactly why his grandfather's hair looks different, why his normally energetic mother is constantly, deeply exhausted and confined to bed rest, and why the entire house feels exactly as though everyone inside is perpetually holding their breath in pure terror. Catherine and William, undeniably, heroically tried to navigate this minefield, and by all reliable accounts, they executed those impossible conversations as thoughtfully, gently, and carefully as humanly possible. However, the best parental intentions in the world absolutely do not erase the raw emotional impact of the truth. The devastating impact was undeniably there. It was heavy, it was completely real, and it landed the absolute hardest on the youngest, most vulnerable member of the family unit. This is precisely where the historical timeline becomes incredibly significant and heartbreaking. King Charles revealed his own shocking, unexpected cancer diagnosis just weeks before Catherine was forced, by mounting public pressure to go public with hers. Within the devastating, highly concentrated span of a single month, young Louis discovered that his mother and his grandfather, two of the absolute most important, foundational, anchoring figures in his entire universe, were simultaneously facing serious, potentially life-threatening illnesses. That is absolutely not a normal, manageable childhood stressor. That is not a scraped knee on the playground, a squabble with a classmate, or a bad dream that comfortably fades by the morning light. That is raw, paralyzing, existential fear, delivered in kid-sized doses, leaving him with absolutely no idea what to do with that overwhelming terror. Reliable sources noted that the young prince started anxiously asking incredibly heavy, profound questions that simply possessed no clear, comforting answers. He actively, frequently sought physical reassurance and comfort late at night, when the silence of the house magnified his fears. The specific phrase used by an insider to describe his demeanor, his wide eyes, is a haunting description that reflects an immense, unspoken psychological weight. That specific behavior is absolutely not a child simply being difficult, stubborn, or acting out for attention. That is a child being profoundly, silently scared for the survival of his world. Throughout this agonizing period, the palace maintained absolute rigid silence regarding his struggles. Absolutely not, because nothing was happening, but precisely because entirely too much was happening behind the heavy closed doors. Prince William later remarkably, candidly referred to 2024 as the absolute hardest year of his entire life. That is absolutely not a casual, throwaway PR line from a man whose entire professional existence and upbringing revolves around performing flawless, stoic composure for a living. That is a future reigning king openly vulnerably admitting to the world that he was emotionally drowning under the pressure, and the precise, exact moment he allowed that highly vulnerable human crack to show to the public, the entire royal narrative fundamentally shifted. But long before we analyze that specific breakthrough moment of public honesty, we must sit intimately with exactly what those agonizing, early weeks actually looked and felt like inside the thick walls of Adelaide Cottage. The palace's strict, mandated public silence wasn't a peaceful void of emptiness. It was a pressurized container. It was the specific, suffocating kind of pressure that steadily, dangerously builds when absolutely everyone in the household intimately knows something is terribly wrong, but absolutely no one is allowed to say it out loud to the outside world. Household staff members were explicitly, strictly instructed to maintain absolute, unwavering discretion regarding the family's daily reality. The children's private school was provided with only the absolute bare minimum of medical information necessary to ensure their physical safety and emotional privacy on campus. Close friends of the family painfully described a royal household exhausting itself by operating on two completely separate, conflicting tracks simultaneously. There was the polished, flawless public track, where everything appeared meticulously managed, highly controlled, and completely secure. And then there was the chaotic, terrifying private track, where a highly anxious 6-year-old was waking up crying at odd hours of the night, directly, tearfully asking his exhausted father if his mother was going to die. You absolutely cannot neatly schedule that kind of raw trauma. You cannot efficiently put that in a daily briefing document for courtiers to strategically manage. It simply, violently happens, and you are forced to deal with it entirely alone in the dark at 2 a.m. with a sobbing child, who absolutely cannot understand why his previously invincible, secure world suddenly feels so incredibly fragile and threatening. William spoke much later about the immense, crushing difficulty of navigating those early, dark days, not in graphic, exploitative detail, but with enough raw, unfiltered honesty to accurately convey the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of the ordeal. He specifically mentioned the constant, heavy mental load, the exhausting, relentless daily effort strictly required to artificially keep things feeling normal for the children when absolutely nothing in their lives was remotely normal. For a man who had spent his entire, highly scrutinized adult life painstakingly learning to tightly compartmentalize his emotions, to rigidly and flawlessly separate the dutiful, public royal role from the vulnerable, private self, this crisis was fundamentally, terrifyingly different. This was his beloved wife, his innocent children, and his ailing father, all demanding his absolute strength at the exact same time. And the rigid, carefully constructed compartment walls simply didn't hold. They couldn't possibly hold, because when your terrified 6-year-old asks you a heartbreaking, existential question that you simply don't know how to answer honestly without causing more pain, there is absolutely no royal protocol handbook or courtier available for that specific situation. There is just you, him, and the heavy, lingering, agonizing silence that immediately follows the question. Fast forward to October 2025. Prince William sits down for an interview with Eugene Levy for the Apple TV Plus series, The Reluctant Traveler. Filmed within the grand, historic confines of Windsor Castle, the interaction is supposed to be incredibly light, deeply charming, and perhaps a little self-deprecatingly awkward in the endearing way William sometimes is on camera. But Levy gently, respectfully asks about the kids, specifically inquiring about exactly how George, Charlotte, and Louis were emotionally affected by Catherine's severe, prolonged illness. And William noticeably, heavily pauses. It wasn't the standard, practiced, media-trained pause where a senior royal is carefully selecting the absolute right, diplomatic, meaningless PR phrase to deflect the inquiry. It was the heavy, pregnant, vulnerable pause where a traumatized father is internally, frantically debating exactly how much raw, unfiltered truth he can actually afford to let out into the public sphere. What he said next is incredibly crucial to document exactly right, because it matters immensely to the historical record of the monarchy. Everyone has their own coping mechanisms for these sorts of things. Children are constantly learning and adapting. We try to make sure we give them the security and safety they need. We're a very open family, so we talk about things that bother and trouble us, but you never quite know the knock-on effects it can have. That specific, carefully chosen phrase, knock-on effects, landed incredibly heavily, rippling out like a heavy stone dropped in still water. Because that is absolutely not the confident, assured language of a man fully in control of his family's environment. That is a vulnerable, honest father publicly admitting he doesn't fully know exactly what is happening deep inside his own child's head, and he is genuinely, profoundly scared of what psychological trauma he might eventually find there. Astute royal correspondents and journalists immediately flagged that specific, off-the-cuff comment as one of the absolute most honest, raw, and unprecedented admissions from a senior working royal in decades. And that is truly saying something, considering the historical bar for genuine royal honesty and emotional vulnerability is typically buried deep underground in a locked vault. William went even further in the discussion, candidly admitting that sometimes he feared he was perhaps oversharing the grim medical realities with the young children, but firmly concluding that actively hiding things from them simply doesn't work. Think deeply about the staggering magnitude of that statement. So, a man raised entirely within a rigid, emotionally stunted family where the unofficial but fiercely enforced motto was essentially, never complain, never explain, explicitly stating on international television that hiding painful truths from his kids doesn't work. That represents a massive philosophical break from generations of emotionally distant, institutionalized royal parenting. But it is also a heartbreaking, retrospective acknowledgement that he likely tried exactly that strategy initially, perhaps attempting to fiercely protect their innocence by tightly controlling the flow of information regarding the chemotherapy, and quickly realized it completely didn't matter. Louis still intrinsically, viscerally knew something was terribly wrong in the house. Louis still deeply felt the overwhelming fear, because children, regardless of their royal titles, absolutely always feel the underlying tension in their environment. Then, during a highly publicized February 2026 BBC Radio 1 mental health special, William was once again discussing his children's complex emotional lives. He chuckled affectionately and warmly about how they sometimes tend to share a bit too much information. But then, the lighthearted laugh abruptly caught in his throat, and he delivered a profound, deeply vulnerable sentiment that should rightfully be printed in every single parenting book ever written. You feel a sense that you need to fix it for everyone, and that I find quite difficult. A future king, A man who will one day command the armed forces and serve as the head of state, openly admitting to the entire world that he absolutely cannot fix everything. For millions of exhausted, empathetic parents watching, that raw admission hit entirely differently, because that is the fundamental, unspoken expectation of the parenting job, isn't it? You are supposed to fix it. You are supposed to magically, effortlessly make the pain go away and make it all better. And when you absolutely can't, when the terrible, life-altering thing hurting your child is a ruthless disease you cannot physically remove, or a terrifying situation you might have inadvertently caused simply by being sick and therefore emotionally unavailable, the resulting parental guilt is absolutely enormous, crushing, and suffocating. William was describing, in highly measured, incredibly careful language, a specific child living in quiet, persistent, unresolvable pain. And reliable, highly placed sources, intimately close to the family, later confirmed exactly what many astute observers had already suspected. The specific child he couldn't stop worrying about during those dark months was Louis. Let's delve deeply into exactly what was actually, physically transpiring inside the walls of that house during the height of the crisis. There were absolutely no official palace statements, no carefully staged, smiling family photographs, and no curated, optimistic medical updates provided to the public. However, quiet, observant insiders painted a heartbreaking, intimate picture that was incredibly hard to look away from. William notably took several critical weeks completely off from his official, demanding royal duties in March 2024, specifically to be physically present at home with his family. He diligently, obsessively maintained their daily grounding routines, executing the morning school runs, enforcing the comforting bedtime rituals, and organizing the standard weekend activities. He was widely described by household staff as remaining constantly sanguine, which is essentially a highly polite, classically British way of saying he was desperately holding his own fragile sanity together purely by sheer force of will. But the children were watching his every move incredibly closely, and Louis, the most physically expressive child, the one who famously wore absolutely every fleeting emotion plainly and unapologetically on his face, was the one who simply couldn't hide his intense distress. Russell Myers, in his detailed, authoritative book about William and Catherine, cited a trusted royal aide who confirmed that both parents sat down and calmly, gently explained the grim situation to the children, detailing roughly how long Catherine would be away, receiving treatment, and exactly what physical changes to expect from the harsh medication. They were remarkably calm and highly composed in the difficult moment. But parental composure in the moment absolutely does not guarantee calm emotional processing for the child afterward. In the agonizing, endless months that followed the announcement, Louis developed exactly what child psychologists clinically term secondary anxiety. That is absolutely not a formal psychiatric diagnosis of a permanent disorder. It is a highly descriptive clinical term for exactly what happens when a young, dependent child directly witnesses a primary caregiver's severe illness and deeply internalizes that overwhelming existential fear. It manifests entirely differently in every single kid who experiences it. In Louis, it manifested as quietness, a deeply uncharacteristic, highly unsettling, absolute quietness. The vibrant, chaotic boy who had once made the entire world laugh by being loudly, joyfully, and unapologetically himself, suddenly went completely silent. Breakfasts in the kitchen grew noticeably, painfully quieter. Fearful, probing questions came late at night, when the distractions of the day faded. Small, daily rituals that used to feel wonderfully ordinary and safe now carried immense, heavy, terrifying weight. A mother absent from the dinner table, a grandfather seriously unwell. There was a dark, heavy, undeniable energy pulsating in the house that even the absolute most cheerful, oblivious child could easily sense, and Louis sensed it profoundly in his bones. Here is another critical, deeply human aspect that people often forget when analyzing this royal family. Louis wasn't just processing his mother's terrifying clinical illness. He was actively, painfully processing the devastating absence of her comforting physical presence in the tiny, mundane, everyday moments that completely make up a child's entire world. He deeply missed the gentle, familiar way she used to ruffle his hair before he left for school. He missed the particular affectionate tone of voice she would use to say his name when he was being silly or rambunctious. He missed the comforting, ambient sound of her simply moving through the house, always there, always a constant, unshakable stabilizing force. When that foundational stability abruptly disappears, even temporarily, a child notices. Not consciously, perhaps, but somewhere deep within their developing nervous system, that sudden, jarring absence strictly registers as a massive, immediate threat to their survival. And for a highly privileged kid like Louis, who had absolutely never known anything but unwavering stability, extreme security, and constant routine, that perceived threat was enormous. He didn't possess the emotional vocabulary or maturity to articulate, "I feel completely unmoored," or "I'm absolutely terrified of losing my mother forever." So, he communicated his terror the only way his body physically could. He got incredibly quiet. He noticeably stopped eating as much as he usually did. He nervously, anxiously, lingered near doorways, entirely unwilling to be alone in a room. He tearfully asked for the hallway lights to stay on at night, to chase away the darkness. These are the heartbreaking, intimate, profoundly normal details of childhood trauma that absolutely never make the bold tabloid headlines, but they matter infinitely more than any polished, official palace statement ever could. Catherine bravely and directly addressed this harsh reality later, after finally finishing her grueling chemotherapy, in a deeply personal, highly produced social media video. She stated firmly, "The cancer journey is complex, scary, and unpredictable for everyone, especially those closest to you. Especially those closest." That crucially, explicitly includes a 7-year-old boy who entirely lacked the necessary words to adequately express his overwhelming feelings of dread. That was absolutely not a throwaway PR line engineered by a communications team. That was a vulnerable mother, publicly, painfully acknowledging that her youngest child suffered deeply in a way she couldn't immediately, magically fix. And honestly, that is the specific part of this story that resonates the most. The highly efficient palace machinery can easily manage a media cycle and spin a narrative to protect the crown. They absolutely cannot manage or spin a child's raw, unfiltered grief. School staff at Lambrook, the exclusive private school where all 3 Wales kids currently attend, were apparently fully aware of the family's dire circumstances from the very beginning. Pastoral care was quietly, heavily enhanced, specifically for the royal children, to ensure they had support. While Mental Health Awareness Week and Anti-Bullying Week are standard, scheduled fixtures on the modern school calendar anyway, this specific situation was entirely different in scale. A child actively going through exactly what Louis was experiencing desperately needed significantly more than a standard empathy curriculum. He needed to be truly seen, fiercely protected, and emotionally supported. And behind the towering palace walls, far away from flashing cameras and heavily coordinated public appearances, his exhausted parents were desperately trying to truly see him. But they were also quietly, inevitably falling apart themselves under the immense, crushing strain of the illness. And that is an incredibly hard, heavy, nearly impossible reality to hold together. Enter Princess Charlotte. She was 9 years old at the time, and already carrying a solid, well-earned reputation within the family as the diplomatic peacekeeper, the one who gently smoothed things over before minor sibling conflicts escalated into full-blown tantrums. During the absolute darkest, most terrifying months of the ordeal, Charlotte intuitively directed that incredible steadiness and maturity entirely toward Louis. She constantly checked on him, sat quietly with him when he was visibly anxious, and seamlessly inserted herself into his daily routines in a deeply comforting way that only an older, devoted sibling truly can. She brought a sense of normalcy and pure comfort that the adults, no matter how deeply loving or well-intentioned, couldn't entirely provide, because they themselves were the very source of the anxiety. And while that is undeniably beautiful and touching, it is also profoundly heartbreaking, because young Charlotte was simultaneously carrying her own immense confusion, terror, and grief, while desperately trying to shield her little brother from his. That is a massive, unfair emotional burden for a 10-year-old child to carry. That is a lot for absolutely anyone to shoulder. There is one specific, touching detail that came out much later, through sources close to the family, that perfectly illustrates this dynamic. Charlotte apparently started quietly, secretly leaving small, handwritten notes under Louis's pillow. It was absolutely nothing profound, just little, innocent drawings and sweetly scribbled messages like, "See you at breakfast," and "You are my favorite brother." She absolutely never mentioned doing it to anyone. It wasn't performative, and it wasn't done for adult praise. It was just exactly what she instinctively did when she noticed he was tossing and turning, struggling to fall asleep in the dark. That kind of quiet, instinctive, deeply empathetic care absolutely doesn't come from being instructed by an adult to help out. It comes from a place of pure, fierce love. And those simple, scribbled notes probably did infinitely more for Louis's fragile mental state than any formal, clinical counseling session ever could have, because they clearly told him, in the comforting, simple language of childhood, that he absolutely wasn't alone in the dark. It told him that someone else in that scary house understood things felt terrifyingly different, and was still there, still present, and still a solid anchor for him to hold on to. William later publicly praised his children's immense resilience, proudly stating they managed the crisis brilliantly. And sure, on the surface, they absolutely did. But managing a massive crisis brilliantly absolutely doesn't mean emerging from it entirely unscathed. Inside the walls of Adelaide Cottage, a moving portrait emerged of three vulnerable kids, fiercely supporting each other, while the very ground shifted dangerously beneath them. Louis, the youngest, trembling with unexpressed emotion, Charlotte, serving as the steadfast anchor, and George, presumably doing absolutely whatever he could to support his siblings in his own, quiet way. Catherine, even while physically exhausted and actively recovering from grueling treatments, kept relentlessly returning her focus to the children's well-being. Her mother, Carol Middleton, was widely described by insiders as an absolute tower of strength, working tirelessly behind the scenes to maintain a strict sense of normalcy and routine for the household. They affectionately called the kids kiddies, which is undeniably adorable, but also deeply devastating when you stop and think about the smallest kiddie quietly processing an immense, existential terror that the paparazzi cameras never caught. But Charlotte saw it, and she steadfastly stayed by his side. There is a very particular, fierce kind of love in that action. The profound love of a child who knows she can't physically fix the terrible thing happening, but utterly refuses to let her little brother face the terror of it alone. Child development experts will readily tell you that a strong sibling connection during a period of severe parental illness is arguably one of the absolute strongest protective factors for building long-term emotional resilience. Charlotte obviously didn't know the clinical psychology behind her actions. She just instinctively did it, and slowly, haltingly, Louis began to finally breathe a little easier. Then came the highly unconventional, deliberate step that truly started bringing him back to himself. It absolutely wasn't a sterile therapy room or a rigid palace directive that facilitated the change. It was freedom of movement, established routine, and a profound sense of safety. The Wales family had originally chosen Adelaide Cottage, specifically because it offered a smaller, significantly more normal, grounded lifestyle. 4 bedrooms, absolutely not a sprawling, echoing palace. It was grounded, manageable, and real. That highly deliberate architectural choice proved incredibly beneficial during the crisis. Louis was given the necessary physical space to move freely, breathe deeply, and simply exist entirely without being constantly watched or monitored by staff. He could just be himself, completely free from the exhausting pressure of performing for an audience. And slowly, beautifully, he began to re-emerge. William fondly noticed, the very first morning, Louis bounded excitedly down the stairs with a flash of his old, chaotic energy. He noted the very first meal, where absolutely every single plate was eagerly emptied, and the very first genuine, booming laugh that didn't have a layer of nervous tension hiding underneath it. These were seemingly small, insignificant moments to an outsider, but to a terrified parent, they signaled something absolutely huge. His son was finally going to be okay. However, emotional recovery is absolutely never linear. That is something the polished palace PR machine never explicitly stated, but the timeline strongly implies it. There were undeniably good days and bad days. Days when Louis seemed vibrantly, almost entirely like his old, joyful self, and difficult days when he quietly retreated back into his shell again. The crucial difference over time was that the good days finally started outnumbering the bad ones. The anxious questions late at night became noticeably less frequent, and then eventually stopped altogether. The breakfast table naturally grew louder and more chaotic again. The bedroom lights could finally be turned off without a tearful protest. These are the vital, invisible markers of healing that absolutely no medical doctor measures on a chart, but every single parent instantly recognizes with overwhelming relief. And William, for all his necessary public composure and stoicism, was vigilantly watching for them, quietly counting them, and desperately holding on to them, like solid evidence that they were all finally going to make it through the storm. By June 2025, at the highly televised Trooping the Color ceremony, the entire world saw the triumphant result. Louis, now 7 years old, dressed impeccably in a black suit and red tie, was seen burying his face dramatically in his hands at just the right comedic moment, and waving so wildly and enthusiastically at the crowds that his older brother George had to gently remind him to stop. He was mischievous, utterly uncontainable, and magnificently, unapologetically himself. The joyful boy had fully returned. But what the flashing cameras captured that day was only the very surface of a much longer, infinitely quieter, and more painful journey. And the final, crucial piece of that healing journey wasn't a specific medical intervention or a prescribed therapy. It was an unprecedented palace statement that fundamentally changed everything about how the family operates in public. Here is exactly what Buckingham and Kensington Palace actually confirmed, quietly, and with the parents' full, explicit knowledge and consent. A royal child had been deeply struggling, absolutely not with a diagnosed clinical illness, but with the profound emotional fallout of a terrifying family health crisis. And the family made the conscious, brave choice to talk about it openly. In October 2025, William publicly acknowledged exactly how Catherine's illness had affected the kids. In February 2026, he candidly admitted he felt the overwhelming, crushing need to fix everything for his family, and found it incredibly difficult when he couldn't. For an ancient institution built entirely on a foundation of stoic silence and emotional repression, these were truly seismic, revolutionary words. Astute commentators correctly noted that William was fundamentally changing exactly how royalty deals with severe personal challenges, bravely choosing raw honesty over slick image management. And that specific, public honesty reached Louis in ways that truly mattered. Because when a child actually sees a parent express vulnerable feelings openly, they implicitly learn permission. They learn they have permission to feel deeply, to talk about their fears, and to know they are completely loved, even while they are actively struggling. Catherine's unprecedented openness achieved the exact same result. She publicly called the journey complex, incredibly scary, and highly unpredictable. She openly expressed deep gratitude for the kindness of strangers. By being so radically open, she gave Louis something absolutely no ancient royal tradition or protocol could ever provide: the grounding truth that incredibly tough, scary times happen to absolutely anyone, even privileged royal families. William later profoundly stated, "Overcoming challenges defines who they are." He openly expressed immense, visible pride in his wife and his children, and at Trooping the Color, the joyous evidence clearly showed that Louis waved frantically, hilariously mimicked King Charles, and laughed heartily. He was 7 years old, and absolutely full of life again. There is a significantly longer, deeper lesson to be learned here, too, about exactly what it means to parent through a massive crisis when the entire world is relentlessly watching your every move. The Wales family could have easily, comfortably hidden absolutely everything behind palace walls. They could have ruthlessly kept Louis completely out of sight until he seemed perfectly fine again, and then seamlessly trotted him out with a flawlessly rehearsed, empty smile for the cameras. Plenty of other royal families throughout history have done exactly that, but they deliberately chose not to. They bravely let the painful cracks show to the public. They let William openly stumble over his vulnerable words on national television. They let Catherine publicly acknowledge that the cancer journey was genuinely scary. They let Louis be fully seen by the world in all his messy, joyful, struggling, authentic humanity. That is absolutely not a sign of institutional weakness. That is a completely different, infinitely more profound kind of strength, and it is probably the exact thing that ultimately saved them from breaking apart. So, what the palace finally confirmed wasn't just a simple PR statement. It was the deeply moving story of a family that faced something truly terrifying together, in the dark, and emerged forever changed, but fiercely united. In a modern world where royalty often feels incredibly distant, sterile, and untouchable, this was a powerful, necessary reminder of their shared humanity. That is the true, unvarnished story of Prince Louis and the severe health crisis that deeply impacted the Wales family. It is absolutely not the sensationalized gossip version, but the authentic one, told through William's raw words, Catherine's quiet strength, and the countless small, tender moments at home that absolutely no camera could ever capture. The monarchy is certainly still keeping plenty of secrets quiet. Of course, that is exactly what they are designed to do. But this time, the rigid wall of silence broke just enough to let the public see something genuinely real and profoundly human. And honestly, that is infinitely more than we usually get from them. Let the palace formally confirm whatever it wants to the press. The undeniable truth was already there for anyone paying attention. It was visible in a 7-year-old's terrified, wide eyes, and in a future king's vulnerable admission that he simply couldn't fix everything. Louis carried the immense, crushing weight of a grueling year that nearly broke his family. And he carried that terrifying burden entirely alone in the dark, until the people who loved him the absolute most figured out exactly how to gently carry it with him. That is absolutely not a royal story. That is a deeply human one, and it is the only one that truly matters.